Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Before we continue, I would ask that all in-person participants consult the guidelines written on the back of the cards on the table. There's a QR code that links to the video. Should you have any questions, this is for the health and safety of participants, especially our interpreters. Make a few comments for the benefits of members. Reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best as we can. I'd like to welcome our first panel. First, David Muscrop, who is a political writer, and from Northern Perspectives, Ryan Davies. You will each have 5 minutes to deliver your opening remarks, and then we'll proceed with questions from all sides. So, Mr. Muscrop, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much for having me. The last time I was here, I was beamed in from South Korea in the middle of the night. So I wanted to start by saying this is much more convenient and much more pleasant, but the food isn't as good. But I am delighted to be here today because this is something I've been following for some time. And in this statement, I want to focus on the goals, trade-offs, effects, and risks to our democratic institutions of the longest ballot committee's activities. Let's start with trying to conceive of what this thing is. I mean, it's a protest. The goal is to protest to effect change. And as a protest, it's meant to disrupt, because that's what protests do. And so disruptive tactics are typical for protests, but the mechanism here is a slightly unusual one, at least in the way the longest ballot committee has proceeded, because they've effectively weaponized election rules meant to facilitate public access to the ballot to raise awareness of two perceived problems and to subsequently make the case for change. Now, the perceived problems, as far as I can tell, are 1, inadequacies and distortions inherent to the first-past-the-post electoral system, and 2, the fact that politicians who stand to benefit from electoral rules are the ones who set those rules. This is what I take to be their complaint. We can discuss my personal opinions on those issues if you want, but I want to focus on the longest ballot for now. Now, the effect of the long ballots, as far as I can tell, have been to draw attention to the group and to their goals, at least I believe to a lesser extent. But I've seen no evidence that the tactics have helped make the case for electoral reform or for a nonpartisan electoral rules-making body. And in fact, a poll from the Angus Reid Institute this summer found that a plurality of Canadians support a law restricting the capacity of the longest ballot committee from stacking ballots with names. In that sense, the efforts of the organization may in fact be undermining their stated goals, at least at this time. So we shouldn't overstate the scale or the effects of the longest ballot committee actions, as previous witnesses have suggested. The effects on election outcomes and voting are likely limited, but we could imagine a protest like this at scale becoming a more serious problem that would undermine the trust in our elections, discourage voter turnout at an equal scale, and even shape the outcome of a race or races. As the world faces a democratic recession from which Canada may not be immune, maintaining trust in elections is critical. And while our elections are regulated, some elements of the process rely on the forbearance of individuals and groups to maintain electoral integrity. So there are certain things you can do that may, strictly speaking, be legal, be permitted, but you shouldn't do them. And doing those things undermines the spirit of the laws and the regulations that govern the process. The net outcome may be deleterious effects on the public good, even if the stated aims of certain actions are rooted in perceiving or are perceived to be rooted in other complementary public goods. Ultimately, I believe that those who take part in the activities of the longest ballot committee are acting in good faith to protest in favor of changes they think will help strengthen Canadian elections and electoral outcomes. But I also believe their efforts don't serve those ends, and in fact undermine them by disrupting the electoral process, irritating voters and election workers, and encouraging election law changes that will make it harder for candidates to get on the ballot. Thank you.
Very much. Mr. Davies, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for the invitation to appear. My name is Ryan Davies, and I am president and co-host of Northern Perspective, an independent Canadian media platform focused on parliamentary transparency and civic education. I'm a 20-year IT professional and executive where I have spent my career leading teams, improving systems, processes, and organizations across broadcasting, healthcare, data management, and government sectors. We have already made multiple recommendations within our parliamentary petition on how to address the longest ballot problem, such as mandating 100 unique signatures, candidates signing an affidavit of genuine intent to run, and fining candidates up to $2,000 if they fail to live up to the genuine intent to run. We first reported on the long ballot during the Toronto-St. Paul's by-election, but began a deeper investigation after the group publicly announced its plan to run more than 200 candidates in the Battle River Crowfoot by-election. What followed raised serious concerns about the integrity of the electoral process. In July, following our expose on the group's origins, we interviewed a verified LBC whistleblower and obtained internal communications, including text messages, emails, and organizer videos sent to LBC candidates. These materials, along with the group's own public posts, reveal 4 key findings. 1. The internal communications show a centralized direction, coordinated timelines, standardized messaging, and top-down instructions from organizers to participants, functioning in practice like a political party apparatus rather than a decentralized protest. I believe this is a direct violation of the Elections Canada Act, as they are operating as a registered political party despite not being registered. 2. Our evidence shows that organizers state they, quote, already have the signatures for participants who had not yet registered or even agreed to run. The communications we received from the whistleblower acknowledges that signatures were collected before organizers knew who the candidates would be. This is a clear violation of Section 67 of the Canada Elections Act and may amount to forgery under Section 366 of the Criminal Code. In his testimony on October 2nd, the Chief Electoral Officer confirmed that Elections Canada has seen the longest ballot committee submit blank forms in past elections and confirmed that the candidate name must be present. 3. Key internal messages state that there were no authorized delegates acting for specific candidates while signatures were being collected. Electors were asked to sign without a properly authorized representative of that candidate, as emails show organizers asking candidates to ensure they designate their delegate after signatures had been collected. This violates Section 67(4)A of the Elections Canada Act and constitutes impersonation under Section 480.1e. This was further corroborated by reports from volunteers for the Libertarian candidate, Michael Harris, during the Battle River Crowfoot by-election, who heard from electors that individuals had approached them falsely claiming to be collecting signatures on behalf of his party. 4. Separate from signatures, our investigation uncovered a substantial and sustained overlap between LBC and the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada. LBC messaging, announcements, and narrative pieces regularly appeared on the MLPC's official website and social channels, with posts encouraging voters to support candidates of the longest ballot project. We could not find similar statements on any other social media platform, including the longest ballot committees. We invited the LBC to appear on air to discuss their conduct, but they refused the opportunity. One candidate initially agreed to an interview, but then withdrew after being told by organizers they were not allowed because the narrative could not be controlled. Shortly after our whistleblower episode aired, we then received a legal demand to remove all coverage of the longest ballot committee within 48 hours. We declined. We compiled our evidence package and emailed Elections Canada on July 25th, 2025 at 12:06 p.m. Eastern. To date, we have received no response. The longest ballot committee is not a protest. It is a coordinated campaign of mischief designed to make a mockery of our democratic process by violating the Charter 3 rights of Canadians across this country. Nothing more.
Thank you so much, Mr. Davies. We'll now turn to Mr. Cooper for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Davies, you testified, but you've interviewed and you've been in communication with a whistleblower who has been associated with the longest ballot committee. That whistleblower provided you with communications from the committee, including text messages, emails, as well as photographic evidence, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, pursuant to the Canada Elections Act, in order to get onto the ballot, a candidate must receive the signatures of at least 100 electors endorsing their candidacy. Some of the text messages and email evidence from the committee indicates or evidences that the committee was collecting signatures from electors before they had candidates to collect signatures on behalf of in violation of the Canada Elections Act. Is that fair?
That's fair, and even some of the text messages that we have from the whistleblower confirm that they hadn't even started the process and were asking for help in order to navigate that process while the signatures were already in hand, as evidenced by the text messages.
Okay, so I'm going to go through some of the relevant text messages and emails, copies of which you provided to me. I have an email dated May 30th, 2024, a mass email, or it appears to be a mass email, sent out from the longest ballot committee. This was during the Toronto St. Paul's by-election. It reads, please excuse me, just throwing out the invite one last time. And then it goes on to say, we've collected the 100 nomination signatures you will need, and we'd love to have you, but certainly understand there are many, many, many good reasons not to participate in our crazy project. Just 3 more days till the deadline for candidate nominations arrives. Signed, Kieran Shukabich. So how is it that electors could have signed nomination forms endorsing candidates before the candidates themselves knew that they were candidates?
Well, and that's the whole question that we're asking, and that is why we try to raise awareness on this and email Elections Canada to ask about this, because if a candidate has not registered as a candidate and therefore has not authorized somebody as their delegate, how can you have that authorized delegate that hasn't been authorized to actually collect the signatures in the first place?
Well, precisely. And then I have another text message exchange between the whistleblower and Kieran Shukabich, dated August 16th, 2024, and during the LaSalle-Imard-Verdun by-election, in which the whistleblower writes, how many people so far going to break the record, as in going to break the record of candidates, to which Shukabich replies, it's 53 right now, probably 60 tomorrow. We collected signatures for 109, so it's possible we'll break 100, but it depends on who can get it all done in the next week. Fingers crossed. And then 2 days later, there was a video posted on the Longest Ballot Committee's YouTube channel of Thomas Shukabich, with the title below, the title of the video being message from the official agent. Now, I've watched the video, and Thomas Shukabich states as follows: if we're going to break the record of the Longest Ballot Committee, we need everyone to sign up as soon as possible. We've already collected 100 nomination signatures for you. Now, just to be clear, that YouTube video has been removed by the Longest Ballot Committee, correct?
After expose, they removed that, and a lot of the other longest ballot organizers disappeared from social media.
Okay, very interesting. How convenient. And then there is a text message from, again, Kieran Shukabich, dated March 31st, 2025, in the context of the Longest Ballot Committee recruiting candidates in the Carleton riding, in which he states to the whistleblower, I emailed you the nomination signatures and official agent form a few days ago. Now, you've talked to the whistleblower about his involvement in the Longest Ballot Committee. According to the whistleblower, he had not indicated any interest in running for the Longest Ballot Committee in Carleton, correct?
That's correct.
He was not involved in the Longest Ballot Committee at that point.
That's correct, and evidence even shows that there's repeated attempts by Kieran to engage him over the course of several days and even the course of a week, trying to get him to say that, yes, I'm going to run, and there was no response by the whistleblower.
And yet the Longest Ballot Committee here already had collected his signatures. How is that possible?
Well, and that's the whole point, and
Right.
It wasn't. And in fact, in Thomas Shukavich's testimony on Tuesday, he was even trying to say, well, we already know who's interested, and then that's how we know how to collect the signatures. But if they haven't registered as the candidate, and there's even another email that we have that specifically is from the Longest Ballot Committee to the whistleblower asking him to, don't forget to assign Thomas as your delegate as soon as possible, but in the same email they say they already have the signatures. So one cannot happen without the other if you're playing by the rules.
Okay, well, Mr. Chair, this evidence is very disturbing. It raises serious questions about whether the Longest Ballot Committee collected invalid signatures, which in turn raises the question, how many candidates connected with the Longest Ballot Committee have appeared on the ballot who should not have because they didn't have the requisite valid 100 signatures as required by the Canada Elections Act, and it raises further questions about whether the longest ballot committee broke the law.
Very brief response. We're at.
I would just say it's, when you look at the scale of how many candidates that the longest ballot has actually engaged with since they started back in 2019, and you multiply this procedure, if they've been following it every single time for every single candidate, you have hundreds of violations of the Elections Canada Act, and potentially that compounds because it could be impersonation, it could be obstruction, and depending on how the Criminal Justice Code interprets it, it could be amounting to forgery as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Davies. You can elaborate with further questions. Mr. Wilkinson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for appearing today. I have a question, I guess, for Dr. Moskrop. We had Dr. Turnbull here on Tuesday, who talked about her perspective that in order to restrict the freedom of citizens to engage the electoral process, it's a high bar. And that even if it's annoying, one has to actually be clear that there are either impacts or significant potential impacts associated with the actions of folks like the Long Ballot Committee. So you touched on this in your comments, but the long-term impacts or the potential impacts of this on a widespread basis, how significant do you think those would be? Did they rise to that level of looking to restrict them? And if so, what would your prescription be for addressing it?
So, I mean, I think it's necessary to study this, and I'm glad you're studying it. I also think it's necessary not to blow it out of proportion. We've got a world in which we're facing a number of serious problems, and we shouldn't pretend that the longest ballot committee is going to destroy Canadian elections and make it impossible for folks to run and get elected. The fact is the vast majority of people who run with parties, and if you're going to win, you're likely to be with the party. The problem is the long-term kind of chipping away at the quality of our elections, the trust in our elections, making life more difficult for the people who make the elections in this country possible. Because frankly, we have one of the best electoral machines in this country has one of the best electoral machines in the world. We run the best elections in the world. We run them with a piece of paper and a writing implement, and volunteers or part-time, full-time temporary workers who have other things that they do, and we should preserve that. We should work very hard to preserve that. So I don't worry that the longest ballot folks are going to destroy Canadian elections, but I do worry that if it gets scaled up or persists over time, it's going to start to add up and create problems. As for prescriptions, I was listening to the testimony from Dr. Turnbull, among others, and I was just thinking, look, there's a few sensible things. One, I thought you couldn't have one person be an agent for more than one candidate. It was absurd to me that that was the case. That seems like an extraordinary oversight on the part of the regulation in the first place. So that's a gimme, I think. The other is, look, whether it's 100 unique signatures or it's maybe perhaps you can sign 3 to 5. I do think there needs to be a little bit more grit. I think it's reasonable to have a little bit more grit to get onto the ballot to prevent stunts like this. Because I do think it's a protest, but I also think it's a stunt. And I think, on the one hand, it needs to be corrected to preserve trust long term, but we shouldn't overreact. Because in a sense, if we end up overreacting, the cure is going to be a little bit worse than the ailment.
Thank you. Let me ask you a question about disinformation and misinformation. You appeared before PROC in 2018. Obviously, there are a lot of things that have happened with respect to artificial intelligence and other things since then. And at that time, you spoke about the need to be vigilant. Maybe you can tell me about how your views have evolved and what you think we should be thinking about in that regard.
Well, things haven't gotten better. Things have gotten so much worse. And when I get nervous about the future of Canadian democracy, I get nervous about the information environment. And when I did my PhD, I studied the psychology of democratic deliberation and political decision-making. And I often joke that if you were to custom design a world hostile to making informed and honest and good faith, rigorous political decisions, it would look exactly like ours. It moves way too fast. There's way too much information. There are often emotional or in-group considerations that trump rational reasons or the public good. And there's a massive corporate incentive to feed people slop, to keep their eyeballs glued to the machines in our pockets that make them money. It's bad news. And yet we don't want to overprescribe a solution that makes life difficult for people who are just trying to navigate the internet, get through their days. We have the unenviable task of trying to rethink how we build citizens. It's very, very tough. I'm in favor of an approach that labels, that people should know what they're looking at. They should know what they're reading. They should have a sense that they can trust it. That onus will likely fall in part on the part of platforms. But we also need to build better citizens. We need people who have the capacity and the literacy to navigate a changing information environment, and that's going to take both, I think, efforts of organizations and to some extent the state, but personal responsibility. People have got to want to be able to navigate this space. And when you look at data on who shares misinformation, disinformation, who falls for it and who doesn't, you often see that there's a split among the population, that some folks who grow up with this technology are better able to navigate it than those who don't. And so we may need a kind of asymmetrical approach to say who's actually falling for this and where. And I'll just close out on this point. I read this morning a bit from the Election Observatory, Information Observatory, or Media Ecosystem Observatory, saying that in the last election, influencers dominated political discourse. Something like nearing half of the engagement and the information that was shared about the election wasn't from politicians, wasn't from the media, it was from influencers. And we don't even know what's going on there. So I would recommend to the committee and to the folks here at some point that we ought to be thinking about that very carefully too as part and parcel of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkinson. That was exactly 6 minutes. We moving right along. Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci
Ms.
beaucoup.
Normandin, 6 minutes. Thank you. I just want to make sure that you are hearing the interpretation. Since the beginning of the study, the main question we've been putting to ourselves is how to find a balance between the potential need to reform the Elections Act to prevent initiatives like that of the Long Ballot Committee happen again, or avoid doing that because there would also be repercussions if legislation were more restrictive. So we need to find the right balance. So my question is to both of you. Do you believe that with all that we've discovered about the Longest Ballot Committee and the violations of the Elections Act that they involved, is there any possibility that the movement dies out by itself because fewer people will be tempted to take part in a move like this if they knew they would be violating the Elections Act?
I mentioned forbearance earlier, and I'll tell you, I was thinking about this yesterday walking around. Like, I'm going to think about this as a democratic theorist. I'm going to think about this as a journalist. I'm going to think about this as a citizen of this country. I'm going to think about this as someone who actually supports electoral reform. What's the best outcome here? And the best outcome is they stop. They take the message. They exercise some forbearance. And they say, you know what? This isn't working. In fact, it's doing harm to our elections, but also to their stated goals. Let's try something else. Let's move on. And then perhaps the Parliament could look at small legislative changes to make it slightly less likely this happens in the future. But honest to God, I think the best answer is they stop. And I know they'll be seeing this, and I certainly hope they take that message to heart, because it's not doing us any good.
And what I would say is we've done a lot of monitoring of the Long Ballot social media, and they've been monitoring these committee meetings. They were monitoring the committee meetings last fall, and they have heard all these suggestions, and on their own social media, they're posting, don't worry, no matter what they do, we're going to continue. So they seem intent on this, and I think that's evidence back from the original court decision in Alberta of 2017, where the lead organizer, Kieran, tried to have all of the restrictions to register as a candidate to vote wiped away. And luckily, the Judge Inglis ended up only striking down the $1,000 bond.
Une autre question. Avec la loi électorale.
One further question. With the Elections Act as it is now, do you think there's a way, rather than amending it, to apply it more effectively to prevent this from happening again or continuing?
Signature checking. I mean, I did listen to the testimony previously and hear that some candidates, the returning officer rejected something. So there was a check and balance there at some point. But here's the thing. If there are problems with signatures, that needs to be caught before a candidate is on the ballot. If it's caught after the fact, then we're talking about consequences for that. But the damage to some extent to the public good is already done. So if people are sneaking onto the ballot that ought not to be there, that's the problem. And now we don't need to talk about checking these things a priori. Incidentally, if we can't control signatures now, if we're going to introduce further restrictions on signatures or requirements, we need to be sure we're ready to actually check them. We can't say, well, we'll let Elections Canada figure it out later. And this comes at a time when the country is looking at reducing budgets. So there's also a budgetary concern as if we're going to spend money, are people going to be ready to spend this money to do it? So I would say, before we start looking at making things tougher, make sure you can actually enforce the regulations you have currently on the books.
And I would say, I agree, money is going to be the issue here. The issue with the Elections Canada Act as it is right now is I look at this from a process architecture perspective, where this is just a big process on how to run an election. However, I don't see any controls in place for this process. So you can say that a candidate or person who must be who is authorized to act on a candidate's behalf, that is a requirement. I don't see any way to enforce that. Where's the control for that? And there's many other examples in the Elections Canada Act where that's the case. And the Chief Electoral Officer even admitted that they don't have the resources to even implement any controls to check the act as is.
Oh, what the hell? Oh, there we go.
Est-ce que on risque pas si on essaie...
If we keep trying to correct things, don't we risk encouraging someone like the Longest Ballot Committee to find every possible loophole in the legislation, and that turns into a cat and mouse game?
There's, as we heard from Mr. Davies a second ago, if the committee decides to keep the Longest Ballot Committee to keep going and going and going in different iterations, it's going to be whack-a-mole. And we're all going to be back here in 18 months, or maybe that's too soon, 2.5 to 4 years doing this again. And then again and again and again. And meanwhile, there are serious problems at scale about the misinformation, disinformation environment, the health of our democracy, and so on at some point. Which is why I keep saying that often the best solution is forbearance. But if that's impossible, then it's going to invite, and this is why I keep saying, it's going to invite a response that works against the outcomes that the Longest Ballot Committee wants. It's going to make life more difficult for people to engage in electoral democracy. It's going to make people less inclined to want proportional representation. I'm less inclined to want it. I've been fighting for it for 15 years. I wake up thinking, it's getting hard to go to bat for this. Yeah. So I hope that they take this seriously, because I think there's a very serious problem, and the last thing we need is a game of whack-a-mole right now.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Normandin. We will go on to Mr. Calkins for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Davies, in your opening testimony, you appeared to be, well, you were very clear in what you surmised to be happening here based on the information that you have. Could you elaborate a little bit more on why you think the Longest Ballot Committee is actually operating as a political party rather than as a protest group?
Well, you just have to look at your own political parties, and it doesn't matter which one you're a part of, Liberal, Bloc, NDP, Green, PPC, what have you. If someone wants to know more about your party, where do they go? They go to your centralized party website where you have all of your media. And the Longest Ballot, they were centralized on X, and now they're centralized on Blue Sky. Most of their media isn't there. They have random social media posts they put up there, but all of their formalized statements, political statements, and formal responses to even committee meetings, statements by the Chief Electoral Officer, they're all posted on the Marxist-Leninist Party website. So there's that. So they formalize all of that into one specific website. But where it really comes into play is they operate as if they're a political apparatus. They're talking to their candidates as if they're running across the country, but they're not. They're running in one riding. They give them all one direction. They're running under a single platform. They are...
Just to be clear, a political entity is only allowed to have one candidate on the ballot in each constituency. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you believe that because they're either committing an offense by running more than one candidate, or they're failing to register as a party. Is that correct?
Correct. The main crux of it is a registered party is only allowed to run one candidate per riding. So they get around this by not being "quote unquote" registered. But
do you think a legitimate candidate gets 0, 1, or 2 votes in an election?
I think a legitimate candidate
legitimate
would be embarrassed to get that amount.
Interestingly, I've been personally quite frustrated since 2017 with the decision by a court in Alberta, which ironically, the witness that was here on behalf of the Longest Ballot Committee is suggesting that people outside of Parliament should be making rules. So here we've had a rule made by a judge in Alberta in 2017, somebody who's not a politician and has never likely run for it, appears to have no political experience whatsoever, has now made a decision to remove the $1,000 bond. I've often thought it was a mistake by the government at the time to not appeal that decision. Can you tell me more? The individual, the case was Kieran Shishkevich versus Canada in that particular case. Is there any relation between that Mr. Shishkevich and the one that testified here 2 days ago?
Sure, he's the brother of Thomas Shishkevich, and the biggest thing that jumped out at me in this decision is actually paragraph 23, where it says the applicant submits that while the deposit requirement is allegedly an attempt to deter frivolous candidates, it may well deter non-frivolous candidates who are not affluent. So,
does the Longest Ballot Committee, in your opinion, have anything but frivolous candidates?
No.
Do you think that, so obviously, from my perspective, this appears to be a well-orchestrated campaign that started well before the, and they knew that they would have to get that $1,000 bond removed, and actually were prepared to go to court. What does that suggest to you about political motivations and the actions of an actual political party?
Well, given the fact that they're trying to get all of the requirements removed, this seems to be a well-thought-out, orchestrated attempt to engage in this behavior in the first place. Because after he won this court challenge, did he run in the election? Not as a legitimate candidate. All of a sudden he teams up with the Rhinoceros Party and they start running these long ballots. And the biggest thing about this court challenge is this was him saying this is violating his Charter 3 rights. But now they're going on to violate the Charter 3 rights of people with disabilities and seniors across this country. And for people to say that this is a small issue, it is not. This is an issue that our forefathers fought for. Yeah. And we need to take that seriously.
Couldn't agree with you more. With all of the information that you have from the whistleblower, plus everything that we know in the public domain, is there anything that leads you to believe that the Longest Ballot Committee is actually just a protest, or are they operating with clear and decisive intent?
I think the fact that they couldn't even answer the chair's question about, okay, fine, let's accept that this is a protest. What's your solution? And they don't even have a thought-out solution, and then they've been doing this for 6 years. They haven't thought about that at all. This shows that they're not serious about an actual resolution, and this is just malicious intent.
Do you think
Thank you so much, Mr.
Totally
Calkins.
agree.
I did cut you
I
off
thought
with
the
3
same thing.
seconds left. I do
apologize.
I'll give you 3 seconds more the next time.
Sure.
Madame Brière, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Moskop, you said in your testimony that it was essential to protect our elections and that we had one of the best systems in the world. We still have paper ballots. And that you said the actions of the Longest Ballot Committee could undermine voter confidence. We know that sometimes it's difficult to get people to come out and vote. We've thought a lot about that. Do you feel that tactics like those of the Longest Ballot Committee could actually discourage people from exercising their right to vote?
It's not encouraging people to turn out to vote. Yes, I do think it could potentially discourage people at the margins from turning out, because who wants to go and wade through 200 names in a general election or a by-election, which already suffer from low turnout, when it looks like a farce. And it raises accessibility issues that we've talked about. It makes life more difficult for everyone. It irritates people. And we know that every time you introduce a little bit of a barrier, turnout's going to go down, right? It's just a very rational calculation of, okay, it's going to be a little more work to do this. Do I really want to put that work in? And it's already a problem that people are deciding they don't want to turn out, especially young people. When you look at the distribution of who turns out and who does it, and you say, well, we get 60% turnout, it's because you have 80x% of older folks and 20-some% of younger folks. And I don't think they're going to be bothered to turn out when they're staring down something like this. Ultimately, the way I see this problem is we're trying to balance the right of an individual to get on the ballot versus the right of an elector to cast their ballot. And that's the core balance that needs to be struck. And if the longest ballot thing continues, it's going to make life more difficult for people to cast their ballot, and that's the last thing we need right now.
Merci beaucoup. Maintenant,
Thank you. Now I'd like to take you to the data and hacking, because under the Elections Act, well, in your view, is there a risk that we might end up in a situation like what we saw in the US and the UK, where an election was compromised by hacking data, the data of one party or another?
Oh, I don't know. The one thing, I was discussing this earlier, and when we approach this issue, we need to think of it, I think, as an issue of freedom, ultimately. And that might sound silly, but it's not. It's ironic, but freedom requires constraints. That if you were to have an ultimate lack of freedom, you wouldn't have freedom, you'd have chaos. That we need constraints in our lives. Anyone who's ever had to force themselves to go to work knows that you need constraints in order to be free. You want to pay your mortgage? You got to go to work. Sorry, I don't like it either, but that's the way it works. In elections, it's the same thing. We limit how much money you can spend because it maintains the integrity of an election. We limit how you can get on the ballot because it maintains the integrity of the election. We try to make sure that third parties, foreign parties, aren't unduly influencing the election, so on and so forth. So part of that is making sure you have good constraints. And then part of it is making sure that your elections are as simple as possible. And I think, again, one of the core virtues of Canadian elections is that they're very, very simple. They're very, very mechanical. In many ways, they're run the same way today that they were run in the 19th century and early 20th century, with better access to the ballot, thank God. But the mechanics of it are similar. And those constraints are effective at running good elections. But when you turn it into a farce, when you make it open season on exploiting loopholes, then I think you invite activity that will further undermine it. And so at the risk of committing the slippery slope fallacy, when things like this pop up, you've got to deal with them, because I do worry it invites further shenanigans that are going to undermine our elections. I'll say it again. This is the worst possible time to be messing around with elections. We could lose the institutions that bind this country. We've seen them lost in other countries. We've seen them undermined here in the past. It's just not something to screw around with.
Thank you so much, Briere. So what I'm proposing to do, and by proposing to do, we're going to do, and it worked well last time. We'll go to Madame Normandin for 3.5 minutes, and then 6 minutes for each of the Conservatives and the Liberals, and then we'll move on to our next panel. So, Madame Normandin, 3.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais vous entendre, professeur.
Thank you. I'd like to hear Mr. Moskrop. We've already talked about this for a bit. I do understand my question is somewhat hypothetical and no longer moot, because the court has already eliminated or prohibited the elimination of the $1,000 bond. But, if I had to post a $1,000 bond, I may never have become a member, and my candidacy was anything but frivolous. So could insisting on the $1,000 have repercussions? Could it hinder the plurality of voices and parties that are of value in the democracy we know? And could this limit candidates from a range of classes? People want to see candidates that look like them. I'd like to hear you on that.
The nature of the problem isn't that people have access to the ballot. The nature of the problem is that someone has weaponized the fact that people have access to the ballot. We think it's good that people have access to the ballot for the reasons you just suggested. You get candidates who otherwise couldn't afford it. You get candidates from different backgrounds. The lack of a bond presupposes that you want individual candidates who aren't connected to parties, or at least rich parties, because parties have no problem coming up with the money, at least the big ones in places where they've got a shot, and some of the smaller ones. What we're really talking about here is individuals who want to take part in the electoral process, but who otherwise are going to find $1,000 prohibitive. So we could talk about, okay, well, what if it were $100, or what if you needed to, $200, whatever. We could talk about scale, but I think the problem isn't that people can access the ballot. The problem is that they've weaponized it, and I worry that an overreaction, or let's say an aggressive reaction that creates barriers to getting people on the ballot, will not just affect those who are weaponizing it, but those who in good faith really want to present themselves as candidates and who otherwise can't raise the money. And you end up privileging the incumbents, privileging parties, privileging wealthy folks, and deprivileging everyone else. So I'd be at least skeptical of that, for the reasons you stated.
Monsieur Davis, si vous voulez ajouter ou peut-être parler de
Could we talk about the balance that needs to be struck between between the risk of limiting non-frivolous candidates and the negative impact of constraints? It might be acceptable in some cases to democracy to have some frivolous candidates.
I think the issue here is how do we uphold everyone's Charter 3 rights? How do we protect the people that are most disadvantaged in terms of allowing them their democratic right to vote? That's one of the main concerns here. But we, to the point, we don't go too far in the other direction in overreacting. But I think we need to enforce the act. That seems to be one of the biggest problems we have in this country overall, is enforcing the laws that we do have. And where having an honest review of the Elections Act, there is a determination that there are missing controls in order to do that, we need to come up with new controls and punishment for people who try to weaponize democracy against itself.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davies and Madame Normandin. We will move on to Mr. Jackson for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Just like to start with Mr. Davies, a couple of questions. You mentioned earlier in your testimony that you or your organization filed a complaint with Elections Canada regarding the Longest Ballot Committee's actions. Can you just make it very clear on the record who specifically you submitted that claim or that complaint to?
So we initially contacted Elections Canada by phone to ask them how to report this, and then they provided, I believe it was the email address info@electionscanada.ca. That's the mailbox we were advised to send it to.
And to date, you have received no response to that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. Would you be willing to table all the evidence and correspondence you have between yourself and your organization and the whistleblower, so that we have that evidence, which I assume was part of the complaint that you filed to Elections Canada?
Certainly, and yes, it was.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just now to Mr. or Dr. Moskrop, I want to thank you for your testimony today. I was going back and forth a little bit with Dr. Turnbull on Tuesday because, and I'll read, I know you watched it, but just what I said was, just to summarize, that I agree, and I agree again with what you've said, that we've probably given this farce too much airtime that only they have gotten excited about. That being said, I do think we have to come to an outcome here. I don't think this can go on. And so, to summarize her position, I asked her that she did not support the restriction of signatures to only being able to sign one candidate's paper, but that she would support a change such as one official agent can only be the agent for one candidate. She said absolutely on the official agent piece, and she said that she wished we didn't have to do the piece about the candidate signatures, but unfortunately that's where we are. And so she actually ended up agreeing with both those solutions. What is your perspective on that? Would you find yourself in a similar place?
Oh, absolutely. Here's the thing. If there are reasonable and unreasonable barriers to running. I think financial barriers can be unreasonable. I think old shoe leather barriers, as in go get signatures, go knock doors, go prove that you're serious, are utterly reasonable. Again, I was stunned that you could have one individual act as an official agent for more than one person. It is on the face absurd, and incidentally, a conflict of interest. Right? I mean, one of the premises of the longest ballot is that politicians are in a conflict of interest. Okay, well, apply the same standard to what you're doing. Using one agent for 100 people or 191 people, also a conflict of interest. It's inconsistent. So on the one hand, so yes. On signatures, yeah, I think if you have to get a handful, 100 whatever signatures it might be, fine. Unique, I did notice the witnesses brought up the point of, look, if you're an elector, you might want to sign 2 or 3 people's forms. Maybe you haven't decided who you're going to vote for yet. I've gone back and forth in a couple elections. People change their mind. But 191? That's obviously against the spirit of the law. So I think it would be reasonable to have a limit of that of some sort. Because here's the thing: if you can't get 100 unique signatures, are you a serious candidate? I mean, I could get 100 unique signatures when I ran for student council president.
Right.
2-termer, by the way. But in a high school of 1,200 people, you can get 100 unique signatures.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the clarity on that, because I do think this committee will need to take the expert advice as to an outcome when we get to the conclusion of this study to ensure, a balanced approach, but certainly a swift one in ensuring that future by-elections, this is in place so that this farce doesn't continue any longer. So I certainly appreciate that. I wonder your perspective on the number of signatures overall that are required. The number is 100 right now. We know in previous Parliament, the government, the Liberal government, actually brought forward a bill to reduce that number of required signatures. I believe it was down to 75. Just wondering if you have a perspective on that, whether you think that's appropriate or wrong-headed given this longest ballot committee and just the general context overall.
I mean, I think it's the difference between, to use a contemporary reference, winning a ball game 6-1 and 7-1. Whether it's 100 signatures or 75 signatures, I don't think there's a material difference there. Because if you can get 75, you can probably get 100. Now, can you get 1,000? That's unreasonable. It's really a matter of scale. So I don't think there's any real pressing. I don't think it's worth the paper you'd have to print it on to reduce it to 75. Really?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's just I think it's a show. It's more of a gesture than it would be a substantive change. Ditto raising it to 125. The 100 is entirely reasonable. But I don't see why you would lower it, unless you're going to lower it to 0, and then you're having a philosophical debate, not a regulatory debate.
Right. Do you have any further perspective on Mr. Davies' commentary about the longest ballot committee, rather than a protest movement, operating as either a political party or a third party, which has been suggested as well in previous conversations, that this is a centrally organized group of a very small number of individuals who are giving central direction to sometimes not even full candidates yet, we've heard in testimony, people who are prospective candidates, and whether they should be governed in some way by either the rules that govern third parties in our elections or the rules that govern political parties in our elections.
Very brief answer, Dr.
I hadn't thought about it until Mr. Davies brought it up, but I found his argument cogent. And again, I'll go back to this. We have effectively an exploitation of loopholes in the law right now that are in violation of the spirit of the law. And I think Mr. Davies made quite a cogent argument.
Thank you so much. We'll move on to Mr. Lewis, please.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be splitting my time with Ms. Karabaga. Thank you to both of the witnesses. I appreciate it. In the limited time I have, I'll direct my questions to Dr. Moscroft. Because of your journalism background, you spoke about the need for trust in elections. And I'm sure most Canadians believe that a free and independent press is essential to Canadian democracy. You referred to what you called an information environment, which I imagine is a combination of traditional media, social media. I wanted to ask you questions to address that specifically during an election period. In your words, in your opening statement, you said you can't oversubscribe a solution, but we can address issues. And so in a way that we want to support quality fact-based and local journalism, as a journalist, what role do you see Canadian journalism in helping to safeguard democracy and building that trust, particularly during election periods?
So I am a strong believer in the supply side argument of good information. It's a betrayal of my politics otherwise. But part of the challenge here is that you have good information and bad information competing in an information environment. And what are people going to go to? To a certain extent, they're going to go to whatever's in front of them, whatever's easiest and cheapest to access. In another sense, they're going to go to things that emotionally resonate with them. Confirm their preconceived notions, they find entertaining, their social group approves of, so on and so forth. That information might be good or might be bad, which is, I'm not talking, I'm talking substantively, but as in it could be bogus. It could be informed or it could be ill-informed. And the challenge is to supply enough good information that you displace the bad information. This is my approach, because you could try to regulate it, but it's extraordinarily difficult. You run into issues of freedom of speech and expression. You run into technical issues and regulatory enforcement issues. It's really hard to do. But what you can do is say, we're going to displace the bad information with better information by ensuring that we have good, trained individuals, journalists out there doing their job, and so on and so forth. The problem is that we have an environment in which influencers, some of whom are quite good and some of whom are definitely not quite good, are out there capturing more and more attention. And I don't know how you address that, right? And I think that's why I keep saying is that the committee ought to think about this, Parliament ought to think about this at some point. How do you displace the bad information with better information, particularly in an environment where the incentives and the structure push a new model of media that include people who frankly just aren't journalists?
Thank you. Part of limiting interference in elections deals with donations to maintain the integrity of an election. Because social media, you control what you write, you don't control what you see. But money can influence what is being out there. Do you believe that untraceable donations, such as, let's say, cryptocurrency, prepaid cards, what is your stance on allowing or disallowing those outright in Canada's political financing system?
Oh, I mean, when it comes to political financing, every time someone makes a donation, you should know who it is. You should be able to know who that person is. But that's not what worries me. What worries me is what happens between elections, because people's opinions aren't just formed at election time. They're formed prior to election time. And we have all kinds of questions. I'm sure we have all kinds of questionable money floating around, influencing people or funding people between elections, right? What I want to know is who's getting paid by whom and in what way between elections to talk about things. Right? We've seen in the United States scandals over funding of influencers, people on YouTube, people on TikTok, people elsewhere, because there are people in the world who want to shape those democracies. I'd like to know who's funding that and why.
Thank you. I'll turn it to Ms. Karabaga.
Yeah, just thank you so much for being here today and for allowing me, my colleague, to take the extra 3 minutes in this panel. My questions will also be directed to Mr. Moscroft. I apologize if I said your name wrong. Just building on what you're talking about and the questions that my colleague's asking around the influencers. You said that in your opening comments that most information that Canadians are consuming right now is coming from influencers online, more so than they're getting from official channels of elected officials or even Elections Canada. I'm actually curious to know how you think we manage that and where do governments play a role in regulating misinformation, because a lot of information is not factual, it can be tracked, it can't be true, and a lot of actors that are foreign can be using those influencers to pass massive information that is probably not true, and what it does to our electorate and our democracy. Can you talk a little bit about what our role would be in managing that without partisanship or censorship?
It's a very easy question. We'll be out of here by next week. That, to me, is the primary question for the future of good political decision-making and democracy is how do you manage information so people have good information and can make good decisions? And you indicated, I think, the core challenge, which is at some level, we want to be able to control what's out there. But the state shouldn't be adjudicating truth or fact for that matter, unless, we're talking about labels on products, that's one thing. But when it comes to democracy, we're making value statements, we're making judgments. And I'm very nervous when the state starts deciding what is fit to pass as a judgment and what's not, because that's going to be inherently subjective and based on values that may not be universally shared in this country. So I come back to the argument of, okay, well, we want to maximize the information Canadians have so that if something is on the internet, you should have a reasonable expectation that you're getting what you think you're getting. If it's AI created, for instance, I'd like to know it's AI created. It's becoming increasingly difficult to know that. But what if it's just partially AI created? How do we do that? I don't know. But so there's at least at the theoretical level, you want to be able to know what you're consuming, but then you want to have the capacity as an individual to navigate that as an individual, as not as the state doing that work for you, but you as an educated person. And so at the one hand, we need to make sure we're educating people to navigate these spaces, but also incentivizing them to do the work. Because I'll close on this point. Let's ask ourselves how people consume this stuff. Maybe they're walking around. Maybe they're watching the ball game in the background. Maybe they're playing a video game. Maybe they're on the bus. When people are consuming things, they're not necessarily sitting down and thinking, I'm really going to dig into what I'm watching now. It's white noise.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank both our witnesses. We'll suspend for a few minutes for the next panel.